You were taught to believe that solitude is failure. That if you end up alone, something went wrong. That silence means rejection. That empty space means you were not chosen. That belief was installed in you deliberately. Because a person who can endure their own company without collapsing is dangerous. Consider this carefully. What if the stillness you avoid, the nights without voices, the rooms where nothing distracts you, are not evidence of your deficiency, but the environment where strength is manufactured? What if separation is not damage, but pressure? Not decay, but heat? Not exile, but refinement? What if loneliness is not something to cure, but something to master? Machiavelli spent his life observing the mechanics of power in Renaissance Italy. He watched rulers accumulate allies and then lose everything. He saw generals command thousands and still fall. He studied bankers who controlled entire cities and then vanished. And through decades of observation, one pattern repeated. The figures who retained power the longest were not those surrounded by crowds. They were those who could endure distance without losing coherence. They knew how to withdraw without disintegrating. They knew how to stand alone without begging the world to save them. There is a reason modern life insists you remain constantly connected. There is a reason you are told that being alone is unhealthy, that you must network, share, belong, be visible, be approved. A person who does not require constant affirmation cannot be steered. A person who does not fear disconnection cannot be leveraged. Dependence is the entry point for control. Independence is its natural enemy. Today you will be exposed to what Machiavelli, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche recognized long before psychology tried to soften it. Insights so disruptive they were buried under centuries of moral conditioning. You will see why the group instinctively resents the individual who steps outside it. You will learn how separation functions not as absence, but as design. And by the end, the state you once labeled loneliness will reveal itself as a strategic advantage inaccessible to most minds. Understand this before continuing. What follows cannot be unseen. Once you internalize it, you will no longer be able to retreat into the comforting fiction that togetherness is always virtuous and distance is always pathological. The illusion will collapse. Robert Greene articulated this tension precisely in his discussion of power when he warned against enclosing yourself behind walls. At first glance, it appears contradictory. Isolation is dangerous, he says. But this warning is misread by those who lack nuance. He is not condemning solitude. He is condemning retreat born of fear. There is a crucial difference between withdrawing to gain clarity and hiding to avoid threat. One is strategic. The other is fatal. When a ruler fortifies himself because he is afraid, those defenses become a tomb. History confirms this repeatedly. Louis XVI withdrew into the ornamented isolation of Versailles while his nation deteriorated. He surrounded himself with flattery and ceremony, severing his contact with reality. When collapse arrived, the walls designed to protect him only ensured he could not escape. Contrast this with a different model of separation. Marcus Aurelius wrote his meditations in isolation inside a military encampment, with death and chaos surrounding him. His distance was not avoidance. It was concentration. Machiavelli himself composed The Prince after being expelled from Florence, imprisoned, tortured by the Medici, and stripped of status. He was not hiding. He was compressing everything he knew into a blade. His isolation was not rooted in fear, but in clarity. When nothing remains to lose, perception sharpens. That is the dividing line. The fragile mind constructs barriers to flee reality. The formidable mind constructs a controlled environment to dissect it. Which one describes you? From early childhood, you were trained to associate solitude with danger. Stories teach this lesson repeatedly. The isolated figure is framed as monstrous. The one who strays from the group is punished. Heroes are surrounded by companions. Villains operate alone. This narrative is not accidental. Societies function through obedience. Markets function through desire. Both depend on your sensitivity to opinion. Both depend on your hunger for acceptance. Both collapse if you become indifferent to belonging. When you are comfortable alone, you stop spending to signal status. You stop reshaping yourself for approval. You stop feeding the system that survives on comparison and insecurity. Arthur Schopenhauer identified this with ruthless clarity. He observed that the rare individual who finds contentment in solitude possesses an internal completeness. Such a person is disruptive. They do not require constant stimulation. They are difficult to manipulate. They cannot be easily sold to. As a result, they must be corrected. Their nature is reframed as dysfunction. Clinical terms are applied. Labels are invented. What may simply be psychological independence is diagnosed as a problem. This is not to deny real suffering. It is to question whether some of the discomfort you feel comes not from isolation itself, but from being taught that isolation is shameful. The real question is not why am I alone? The real question is who benefits when I believe that being alone makes me inferior. Those who understand power grasp something most never will. Original thinking is born in separation. Nietzsche ascended into the Alps alone. His ideas were not produced in discussion rooms or intellectual gatherings. They emerged in silence so intense it would have fractured weaker minds. When he wrote that those who rise higher appear smaller to those who cannot ascend, he was not boasting. He was describing a perceptual gap. When your thoughts are no longer filtered through consensus, you become invisible to those who only see through the collective lens. That invisibility is leverage. Extended solitude does something precise to the mind. The borrowed voices fade. Reflexive opinions dissolve. The mental noise thins. Eventually, a different signal emerges. Your own. For many, it is the first time they hear it clearly. Anthony Storr documented this pattern repeatedly among innovators. Newton isolated during plague and restructured mathematics. Darwin withdrew for decades to refine evolution. Kafka worked alone at night to produce work that still unsettles modern consciousness. Their isolation was not an obstacle. It was the condition. Groups do not generate originality. They amplify, imitate, and dilute. Creation requires separation. If you are alone now, you are standing before unmarked terrain. Whether it becomes a wasteland or a workshop depends entirely on what you do next. Machiavelli noticed a pattern that repeated itself across courts and kingdoms. The ruler who surrounded himself with too many hands always ended up bound by them. A man who cannot stand without support is never truly standing. He is being held upright by those who understand his dependence and quietly profit from it. His alliances are not formed from strength or choice. They are formed from fear. And fear is legible. People feel it before they can name it. The moment others sense that you need them, the balance tilts. Respect begins to decay. Familiarity turns invasive. Lines are crossed because they know you lack the nerve to leave. You are no longer someone to be valued. You become something to be managed. This pattern does not live only in palaces. It governs friendships that slowly sour, romances that quietly rot, partnerships that drain more than they give. The one who dreads solitude will endure behavior that should be intolerable. They stay where they are diminished. They call loyalty what is really endurance. They accept mockery disguised as humor, agreements that erode their position, intimacy that costs them their dignity. They compress themselves into smaller and smaller shapes to remain acceptable. All of this because isolation feels like extinction. Because silence feels like falling off the edge of the world. But this is the inversion that changes everything. The capacity to be alone is not a flaw. It is the spine of all genuine power. When you are capable of walking away, truly capable, something fundamental shifts. You stop bargaining from lack. You stop mistaking attention for value. You meet others as a complete entity rather than a starving one. And this is where the paradox emerges. Detachment does not repel. It attracts. Those who are at ease with themselves do not grasp, do not chase, do not perform. They occupy space without pleading for permission. Their presence carries weight because it is not begging to be validated. Desperation leaks. Self-containment holds. This is not a tactic and it is not theater. It follows the same laws as matter. What clings is pushed away. What is grounded exerts pull. Now understand the method that separates amateurs from strategists. There is a maneuver so misunderstood that most people sabotage themselves while attempting it. It is withdrawal, but not the childish version fueled by resentment or theatrics. When position weakens, the untrained instinct is pursuit. They send longer messages, make louder arguments, increase availability, explain themselves into irrelevance. Every move announces anxiety. Every attempt tightens the grip that is already failing. The Machiavellian response is the inverse. He steps back. Quietly. Cleanly. No ultimatums. No wounded speeches. No gestures designed to provoke pursuit. He simply reduces access. He becomes harder to reach, slower to respond, less invested in outcomes he does not control. When Machiavelli himself was stripped of office and sent away from power, he did not grovel for return. He did not crowd the gates with appeals. He disappeared into work. He sharpened his mind. He wrote. And from that isolation emerged a force that would outlast the men who had cast him out. Retreat, when done correctly, does not signal defeat. It resets the field. First, it returns your attention to you. The energy that was leaking toward indifferent people reconstitutes itself. This alone restores strength. Second, distance restores vision. Proximity distorts judgment. When you are entangled, you cannot see clearly. Space reveals patterns that closeness conceals. Third, it activates something primal. Scarcity recalibrates value. When presence is no longer guaranteed, it is re-evaluated. But none of this functions if the withdrawal is counterfeit. If you retreat physically while remaining emotionally tethered, refreshing screens, waiting for reactions, you are still owned. That is not strategy. That is self-deception. Real retreat demands internal separation. Your focus must genuinely return to your craft, your body, your direction. You must become occupied enough with your own construction that their absence fades into irrelevance. This is where most fail. Because this level of disengagement is uncomfortable. And discomfort is the gatekeeper. Schopenhauer understood this with ruthless clarity. He saw what most refuse to admit. Much of what people call social life is merely anesthesia. Noise used to avoid confronting the self. He argued that the measure of a person is revealed by how they endure their own company. Those who flee solitude are not lonely. They are avoiding something unresolved inside themselves. No amount of stimulation will cure that. It only delays the reckoning. This is why many who thrive on constant interaction unravel when stripped of audience. Without reflection, without feedback, their identity collapses. Remove the mirrors and the image vanishes. But those who have endured isolation, who have sat with their thoughts without distraction and remained intact, develop something uncommon. A self that does not require witnesses. A core that remains stable regardless of who is watching. Schopenhauer called this inner wealth. The ability to generate meaning internally. To find engagement within one's own mind. This is not coldness. It is sovereignty. And it unsettles those who lack it. Because when they encounter someone who does not need the crowd, they glimpse the confinement they never questioned. They see a person who escaped a cage they still decorate and call a home. Let me tell you something the crowd will never admit aloud. Society despises the person who walks alone, not because they fear your body, but because they fear your mind. Your independence is a challenge to their entire way of existing. Every hour you spend at peace in your own company shouts a quiet accusation. It exposes the performance that everyone else depends on to feel safe, the ceaseless chase for attention, validation, and approval that keeps them tethered to the herd. Every time you decline the party, the gossip, the petty contests for status, you illuminate the uncomfortable truth. Life outside the constant thrumming of social expectation is possible, and that truth is intolerable to them. They will ridicule you. They will pathologize your autonomy. They will label you antisocial, eccentric, too serious, too intense, too distant. Let them. Humanity has been warning itself about the tyranny of the collective since before language. The herd exerts its will without swords or laws, through looks, whispers, and exclusion, a slow but unrelenting pressure on anyone who refuses to bend. Yet the herd's power only extends over those who still crave inclusion. The instant you release the need for their acceptance, their tools lose all effect. Their scorn becomes meaningless. Their judgment is revealed as nothing more than the frightened noise of those who cannot conceive a life outside the flock. Susan Cain documented in Quiet how Western culture systematically devalues introspection. The gregarious, talkative, attention-seeking ideal is presented as vitality itself, while the contemplative, the reserved, the solitary are dismissed as incomplete, defective, or broken. This is propaganda, not truth. History proves otherwise. Some of humanity's deepest achievements emerged from minds that demanded solitude. Einstein formulated relativity while confined to a quiet patent office. Wittgenstein fled to a remote cabin in Norway, where silence fueled insight that would reshape philosophy. Emily Dickinson wrote verse in near-total isolation, words that would outlast empires and courts alike. The crowd generates noise. The solitary produce legacy. The choice is yours. The method I call transmutation is the alchemy of converting the isolation that terrifies most into the sovereignty that terrifies the fearful. This transformation eludes the majority because they avoid stillness. They medicate themselves with endless distraction. Screens, feeds, noise, and shallow connection. But if you are listening, if you are willing to face the quiet, you may be prepared to do what few ever attempt. The first phase is acknowledgement. Stop pathologizing your solitude. Stop treating it as a problem to fix, a gap to fill, or a defect to cure. Your isolation is not a symptom, it is raw material. Every hour you spend alone is an hour uncontaminated by others' expectations, projections, and shallow influence. This is a rare inheritance. Most humans live their entire lives without experiencing a day of true psychological independence. Their preferences are borrowed, their judgments shaped, their identities composites of unexamined influences. You, in your solitude, have access to something they cannot. An unmediated encounter with your own mind. The second phase is excavation. Alone, without distraction, the hidden corners of your psyche emerge. Buried fears rise. Suppressed desires demand recognition. Shadows you have long ignored press to be acknowledged. Most flee at this stage, returning to noise, to distraction, to the soothing illusions of external life. But the Machiavellian understands. The leader who cannot face their own weaknesses will be undone by them. Knowledge of the self is a strategic weapon, not a luxury. Only those willing to sit in darkness long enough to witness what resides there gain this edge. The third phase is integration. You take the pieces you uncover, fear, anger, shame, secret desire, and fold them into your conscious identity. Light alone is insufficient. Power emerges when darkness is accepted and mastered. Carl Jung called this shadow work. Centuries before, strategists and philosophers practiced it intuitively. They recognized that understanding human cruelty, desire, and vulnerability was necessary to wield them rather than be consumed by them. The fourth phase is construction. Having cleared debris, excavated the self, and integrated its hidden elements, you possess what most never attain. A foundation. From this base, you can build deliberately, guided by principle, not social expectation, not applause, not consensus. Sovereignty is internal. It is not dominion over others, it is mastery of oneself. Your kingdom is psychological. No circumstance, no mob, no fleeting trend can dislodge you, because your power originates from a source others cannot touch. This is the gift your solitude offers, if you are willing to embrace it. Consider how this transmutation has appeared across history. Nietzsche, wandering Europe abandoned by friends and estranged from comfort, did not collapse under despair. He transformed exile into creation, composing Thus Spoke Zarathustra, a meditation on humanity forged through darkness. Loss became his lens, solitude became his laboratory. John Milton, politically defeated and blinded in later years, withdrew from the world that had rejected him. Most would have succumbed to grief. He did not. In isolation, he wrote Paradise Lost, an epic shaped by exile and adversity, a vision of mankind and divinity illuminated by the mind of one removed from the applause and distraction of the collective. Loss became insight. Isolation became immortality. In both cases, suffering and absence were not obstacles, they were raw elements transmuted into enduring power. The process is neither quick nor comfortable. It demands that you resist the seductions of social affirmation, that you face your own depths without flinching, and that you construct your inner empire from the unmediated materials of your mind. But the payoff is sovereignty. Those who fear solitude will remain dependent, weak, and bound to the rhythms of others. Those who endure it, excavate it, and transmute it emerge untouchable, fully themselves, entirely autonomous, and unknowable to the herd. This is what your alchemy demands. This is what your isolation can deliver. And if you are willing to take it seriously, nothing in the world can stop the power that grows in silence. Consider another example from history. In the mid-19th century, a man removed himself entirely from the distractions of society. Alone, far from his peers and the clamor of the world, he lived in a modest cabin beside a quiet lake. For years, he stripped life down to its essentials, observing, reflecting, and learning what truly mattered. Out of that disciplined solitude, he did not simply produce a book. He forged a philosophy that defied conformity, a framework for resistance. He demonstrated that the routine of quiet desperation, the life that most accept without question, was not inevitable. Isolation was not exile, it was liberation. He wrote, "I never found a companion as companionable as solitude." The lesson is clear. Those who embrace their separation are not victims of it. They are shaped and strengthened by it. Now, let us translate these lessons into practical power. How do you transform your solitude into a weapon? First, establish rigorous rituals. Solitude without structure can quickly become a mental trap, a spiral where anxieties and doubts rotate endlessly with no resolution. This is destructive isolation, the kind that erodes rather than strengthens. Productive solitude requires architecture. Deliberate routines that channel your alone time into creation, study, reflection, training, or craft. The great strategists of the past practiced this consciously. One exiled thinker would toil in the fields by day, then at night don the formal robes of his former office and enter his study, engaging with the wisdom of the ancients as though still seated at the center of influence. The ritual was not vanity, it was preservation. It maintained identity, sharpened intellect, and reminded him that circumstance could not erase what he had cultivated within. Your routines must serve the same function. They anchor you to purpose, preserve your sense of self, and transform idle hours into the forge of mastery. Second, cultivate intellectual companionship. Physical solitude does not require mental isolation. Books are portals to minds that span centuries, conversations that transcend time and circumstance. Reading thinkers who confronted similar trials offers a connection the crowd cannot sever. Engage deliberately with ideas that challenge and provoke, that demand engagement rather than passive consumption. This is a network of intellect, invisible yet profoundly real, a constant dialogue that strengthens and stretches your mind. Third, document and track your progress. Isolation can blur perception of growth. Without visible feedback, even profound advancement can feel invisible. Counter this by creating tangible evidence. Write daily, train deliberately, record achievements, measure your evolution. This record is your proof, both to yourself and eventually to the world. When you step back into social spheres, you need not justify your time spent alone. Results speak louder than explanations. Fourth, practice strategic re-emergence. Solitude is not permanence, it is preparation. The mountain hermit eventually descends to the valley, but when they do, it is on their terms. Re-emerge not in desperate pursuit of validation, but bearing the fruits of your cultivation. Insight, skill, clarity, perspective. Others will notice. Your presence will carry weight, subtle but unmistakable. The solitude you endured reshapes perception, magnifying impact, even if you cannot yet measure it yourself. Now understand this. Some people are inherently designed for solitary endurance. Not eternally, not entirely, but fundamentally. They are not flawed, broken, or missing something. They are conditioned differently, adapted to thrive where others would wither. Like creatures that survive the harshest winters or plants that flourish in deserts, your internal wiring is not an error, it is a different blueprint. Attempting to force yourself into a mold designed for the social, gregarious, and constantly interactive is futile. Schopenhauer observed that ordinary people merely seek to occupy time, whereas the intellectual or sovereign individual uses it. Perhaps you are not lonely. Perhaps you are simply engaging with your time in a way that those unaccustomed to solitude cannot comprehend. This does not mean all isolation is advantageous. Fear-based withdrawal, the type Machiavelli warned against, produces weakness and stagnation. But there is also sovereign solitude. A deliberate, strategic positioning of self for work and mastery that the crowd cannot disrupt and would only dilute. You must identify which kind defines you. If your alone time is an escape from rejection, it is a wound to heal. But if you are alone because the insights, strength, and clarity within that solitude cannot be replicated in company, then you are awakening. The world will tell you otherwise. It will insist that connection is essential, that isolation is failure. It will pathologize your preference and attempt to fill your solitude with distraction. Ignore it. They cannot grasp the forge in which you labor. They cannot comprehend the work being performed in silence, the fires that refine what is essential within you. They speak from terror of emptiness. You speak from mastery of it. So, what does this leave you with? You are alone. Perhaps tonight. Perhaps tomorrow. And rather than seeing this aloneness as punishment, understand it as a territory to explore, a laboratory to experiment within, a forge for creation. You are being prepared, not condemned. The solitude you inhabit strips away the inessential. The performed masks, borrowed identities, and diluted opinions. All that remains is the core. From that core, you can construct something impervious. A self that requires no external validation, cannot be unsettled by rejection, and stands independent of social circumstance. Machiavelli did not write The Prince to charm or appease. He wrote it to convey truth, harsh, precise, eternal, and that truth outlived princes, politicians, and centuries of power struggles. Your solitude can produce the same. Perhaps not a book, but a self. Integrated, deliberate, and unyielding, impervious to every gust of social wind. That is the gift concealed within your isolation. Take it. If you are still watching, you are different from the casual audience who clicked away. Subscribe if you have not. As this video closes, carry one thought into your next encounter with solitude. When you feel that familiar ache, pause. Ask yourself, is this a sentence, or a preparation? The crowd cannot hear the lessons hidden in silence. You can. The fire you feel is not punishment, it is the forge of your becoming.